this year's Household in Conflict Network annual meeting. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Arif Husain. Arif lives, works, and I think breathes the ethos of the network in his job as chief economist of the United Nations World Food Programme based in Rome. I trust you all know the World Food Programme. It is, of course, the largest humanitarian organization in the world. I believe it is the largest airline in Africa, and it is the largest operator of school canteens in the world. And it is, of course, this year's recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, to be awarded in a month in Stockholm or on Zoom, I'm not sure, but either way, probably on my birthday, the 10th of December. I calculated that each employee of WFP won on average a Nobel Peace Prize share of €50, which I think demonstrates mostly how large the organization is. Arif, as I said, is the chief economist of the WFP, and that role works tirelessly to address the needs of some of those people who are most at risk, poorest and voiceless in the world, and whose lives and livelihoods we also study here in the Households in Conflict Network. Arif also makes sure that WFP support is organized effectively, evidence is gathered, and policies align with what works and what doesn't. I personally deeply admire the work of WFP and its many dedicated staff, many of whom work in very tough environments, often at great personal sacrifice. I also think that WFP may be a challenging environment to work in as an economist, as parts of the humanitarian community functions along legal and moral principles first and perhaps foremost, with a much smaller role for economists and evidence than, say, in the development field. Arif personally is familiar with this artificial divide between the development and the humanitarian sectors, having obtained a PhD in applied economics from the University of Minnesota and having subsequently worked for many years at the World Bank and then the WFP. With this very appropriate background and knowing Arif to be an excellent analyst and a clear thinker, we have a truly wonderful guest with us today. We will now hear Arif's keynote speech for about half an hour, followed by equally half an hour question and answer session. I invite all of you to post questions in the chat. Having said that, given that we have a lot of time for Q&A, we can also have some live questions. So please let me know if you want to ask a personal question, and all I ask is that you're relatively brief. Thank you for joining us today, Arif. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tillman, and hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, really honored to be here, and call it a keynote, call it something else. I mean, for me, it's a discussion with colleagues, and it is about bringing out what we see on the ground, how things are changing, and most importantly, how do we look at it going forward? I think that's really the most important thing for me. So what I wanted to do was to start out by sketching the current food security situation of the world. You know, and as an economist, I live to my reputation of numbers. So I give you a whole lot of numbers, some current and some not so current, but hopefully it will allow us to make a good case of how we need to go forward. I mean, said that, as you all know, I mean, we look at hunger, food security in two shapes. One is chronic, people who go to bed hungry every single day, regardless of a shock. And then the other one obviously is acute, where something happened. And people who were okay are suddenly find themselves not okay. And what's sad is that for the last, let's say about 6 years, chronic hunger has been going up. 6 years ago, we had about 630 million people. At the end of 2019, we had 690 million people. That's an increase of about 60 million people. Between last year and this year, about 10 million people increased. When we look at acute hunger, in 2015, we said about 80 million people were in acute hunger. Hunger because of climate conflict, things like that. Earthquakes, droughts. Just before the end of 2019, that 80 million had already become 135 million in 55 countries. So that was going up. And when we look at these figures on the acute side, we put people in what we call the IPC classification, integrated phase classification, meaning you put them in a category, starting with phase 1, which is you're okay, phase 2, you're a bit stressed, phase 3, you're in a crisis, phase 4, you're in emergency, phase 5, you're in a catastrophe or in a famine. And what was interesting is that already at the end of 2019, we had 30 million people who were already in emergencies, meaning in phase 4, with in about 36 countries, 36 countries. And why? Like I said, biggest reason, conflict. In fact, conflict is so big that if you look at chronic hunger, 60% of the people we deal with are in conflict-affected countries. Most of the acute hunger is in conflict-affected countries. If you want to talk nutrition, most of the stunted children, most of the wasted children, altogether about 200 million children, are in conflict-affected countries. So either way you cut it, you cannot get away from conflict. Unless you solve conflict, you cannot solve food insecurity. The second thing which we see quite a whole lot is impacts of climate change. Now our term is, call it climate change, call it climate extremes, call it climate variability, doesn't matter what you call it. But at the end of the day, on the ground, things have changed. And I'll give you a couple of examples. This was a study done of about 51 countries, where what they found was that of those 51 countries, in 28 countries, either the agricultural season has shrunk, or it started late, or it started early. In about 14 countries, it was both. It started early or late, and then it also shrunk. So why is that so important? Now, the point is that if you believe that there are 500 million smallholder farmers, and if you believe that they're set in terms of when they plant, and when they plant, rains which used to come don't come, what happens? And if you believe that they had seeds just of a type of a variety which matured, let's say in 4 months, and now the season lasts only 3 months, what happens? So either way, because of these changes, what you see is that some smallholder farmers are getting impacted. Larger holder farmers are also getting impacted, but they have a better ability to adjust to all of this when compared to the smallholder farmers. So if you plant, it doesn't work. Second time, you don't have enough seeds, or you have the wrong seeds. This is what we see on the ground. The third reason, which is very clear, is the economic downturns and economic marginalization. Already before, at the end of 2019, of that 135 million, there were about 34 million people who were impacted because of economic marginalization. So on top of that, you can put this and say, hey, this is not one thing at a time. Conflict impacts climate, impacts economics, and most people suffer because of the combination of all three of these. You could say, hey, the biggest indicator was this, but it is usually the combination of all of this. And guess what? I haven't said anything about COVID right now. COVID changed or exacerbated all of what was already really, really bad. And again, back to numbers, in terms of acute hunger, it added about 135 million in 2020. That takes the total to about 270 million people in acute hunger in 2020. It added, according to our SOFI report of 2020, between an additional 83 to 132 million people to chronic food insecurity. World Bank came back and said that they're expecting at least an additional 150 million people in extreme poverty. And on the hunger side, what we see right now is that 4 countries are at elevated risk of famine as we speak. Northeast Nigeria, Burkina Faso, South Sudan, Yemen. There are additional 8 countries which have more than 1 million people each, way more than 1 million people each, who are already in phase 4 and worse. And that is on the hunger side and on the poverty side. Now, when we start to look at, okay, so this is 2020, what about 2021 in general? Are the good things going to improve? World Bank predicts 5.2% contraction in the normal scenario and 8 point something contraction in their downside scenario on the global side. The debt of low and middle income countries right now, as the end of 2019, stood at about $8.1 trillion. The debt servicing for this, for the poorest countries, is about $45 billion. Of the 73, what you call the ODA countries, IDA countries, 43 today spend more on debt servicing than their own health sectors. This is with COVID. Yeah. Remittance flows are supposed to be, and I'm talking official remittance flows, are supposed to be down by about 14.5% this year and next year. And this is not the informal part. Informal part, I don't know, it's almost as big as the official part, but on the informal side, if people are not moving, if things are not moving, what is happening to the informal remittances? Then you look at the job losses, and according to ILO, still up to second quarter, 495 million jobs lost, full-time jobs lost. 94% of the global workforce has so far experienced some kind of lockdown. And what does all of that translate into? Currency devaluations, inflation at extremely high levels, and rising debts. Look at Lebanon, look at Syria, look at Yemen, look at Sudan, look at Zimbabwe, look at Nigeria, look at Ethiopia. All of these places are hurting. They're hurting because their currencies are hurting, because also primary commodity exports like fuel are not there, or the prices are too low. Or for many others, tourism isn't working. So pretty bleak situation altogether, what we have seen this year and how we are going forward looking at it. But then you come to the next question, which is, so what's the response? And believe me, response has been unprecedented. I'm not talking about WFP yet. But if you look at the global fiscal actions, according to IMF, so far in 2020, has been $11.7 trillion to stabilize economies and contain the pandemic. If you look at the central bank action, it has been $7.5 trillion so far. IMF debt service relief for 29 poorest countries. G20 suspended debt payments till the end of this year. On Friday, they're talking again to see whether it can go further or not. And my point is that these are all good things. But if you're spending almost 15–20% of the global GDP in 1 year to contain this nations big and small, could you expect the same type of a response next year? And my sense is that I don't think so. So next year, while we are seeing that the needs, if they don't increase, they will still stay the same. The ability of nations to respond would be much lower than it has been so far. The hope is, okay, you know, if the vaccine comes or some kind of therapy comes and it is affordable and it is available and it is done quickly, maybe things could change. But so far, it's optimistic, hope, you know, but let's see. So that's the global response. You say, okay, what is it the WFP is doing? And for us, this year, we want to get to 138 million people. Our previous record high was 113 million people right after the Iraq War. Okay. And so far, we have already reached about 85 million people till mid-year, and let's see how, you know, where we end up. But we are optimistic that we will be able to reach more people than we have any time in our history. Now, I want to turn from here and say, okay, so all of this is happening. We're doing all of these things. But in our tendency always is that when we are working, talking to donors, talking to governments, talking to people, they say, hey, what's the cost of this action? How much is it going to cost to do this? And lately, we have also started to ask, but can we talk also about what is the cost of inaction? What if we don't do anything? What will happen? You know, is there a cost? And what type of cost is it? Is it a moral cost because people died because you didn't do anything? Is it an economic cost because it cost a whole lot of money to a whole lot of people? Or is it a political cost where the landscapes of continents changed as a political cost? And I would like to take a little bit on that side and give you essentially 3 examples. The first one is about war in Syria. And Syrian war started in 2011. And we didn't see a mass movement of people into Europe till 3rd quarter of 2015. So one of the questions which was raised was, if people just wanted to move, then why didn't they move early? What was so special about 2015 than before that in terms of people movement? And we actually studied that, actually it came out as a study where we, you know, empirically determined the determinants of migration. But we also did a qualitative analysis where we talked to refugees in 5 countries, meaning Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Italy, and Greece. And what we found was that a few highlights that the obvious reaction of people when something happens is not to say, okay, let's go because a problem happened. What we found was that even in places like Syria, where there was active war, people moved between 3 to 6 times within Syria, even before moving to a place like Lebanon, which is about 40 Ks. Beirut and Damascus is about 40 Ks. Right. And we also found that it also depended a whole lot of how you were being treated where you were. Meaning, when people went to Lebanon and Jordan in 2011 and 12, it was a very welcoming approach. You know, you're our brothers, you're our sisters, come, you're in trouble, we'll help you out, our houses are your houses. By the time we arrived in 2015, that was like the whole thing had changed in terms of they've taken away our hospitals, they've taken away our schools, where they've, you know, our rents have gone up, our food prices have gone up. This is such a huge burden. On top of that, what we also saw was that the aid starts to cut, because it's been 4 or 5 years. So in places like, you know, Lebanon and Jordan, we start to cut rations. Not just the World Food Program, humanitarian community as a whole. And it became about a decision for most people. Either they sit there and they spend their last $100, or they do something else and go someplace else. And a lot of people took their decision to go someplace else. And people have asked me in, you know, in many ways, like, you know, how do people decide? And the answer which we found was that it depended on the risk appetite of people, right? Because there was always a risk of leaving your place and going someplace else. And if you have to get on a boat, and that boat has some chance, minute chance of going under, but you put yourself on that boat, but you put also your family on that boat. That switch point where you say, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. That's what started to do this thing, to move people out. And then what we did, the second part, was to see what did that mean for people in Germany, financially speaking. And what we found out was that the person, apples to apples, it was 17 times more expensive to provide the same benefit in Germany than it was to provide that benefit in Lebanon or in Jordan, right? So you had a situation where people didn't want to move, circumstances forced them to move, they moved, and in order to take care of them where they moved, a lot more was spent than would have been otherwise. And by the way, right now I'm just talking dollars and cents. No political cost involved in all of this, right? So for me, I mean, that is something which is extremely, extremely critical going forward. Now, that's just a Syria example. The second example is Central America. We've heard about building the wall. You know, we've heard about, you know, economic migrants coming to the US. And we did in 2018, 2019, we actually looked at that. And what we found was, and by the way, this was also Border Patrol actually did a study on this as well, and our conclusions were exactly pretty much the same, was that most people who were going to the US were going from the Central America Dry Corridor, from counties which had the highest level of poverty and food insecurity. Okay. And again, it was the same thing that people did not want to move, but there was no light where they were. So they had no option but to try that. And then if you do the trade-off of what has been spent to keep them out, a fraction of that could create situations where they don't have to move anyway. Again, economics, just dollars and cents. And then the third one, and by the way, this is all published now, what I'm saying. The third one is the Sahel story. Everybody, right now, if you ask politicians in Europe, the biggest place where they're worried about is Sahel. Burkina, Mali, Niger, Northeast Nigeria. And the biggest worry there is that because of the economic marginalization, because of all these droughts and everything, there is a vacuum being created. And that vacuum is being filled by the likes of Boko Haram or ISIS or others. And if we don't do anything about that, there will be destabilization and there will be migration. And here, you know, I was in Syria's case, I was using the example of Mediterranean. Here it's even worse because most people who come to Europe from West Africa, they have to cross through the Sahel, through the Sahara and Libya to get to Europe. And what we have done, we have a migration pulse where we interview people on quite a regular basis through web-based surveys and also through mobile surveys. What we found is that, again, the biggest one, that people who leave from the Sahel side, they're younger. Their demographics are a bit different. But they're willing to take that risk and willing to move out, pass through the Sahara, sometimes with their families, knowing that they may be trapped, they may be enslaved, they may be raped, but they still do it. So the logical question becomes, how bad things have to be for them to make these decisions in places where they are? Remember, the days of not knowing and, you know, they're long gone, right? Because you learn from the person who just left the day before. So it's not like, you know, they didn't know and they took this route. No, it's not like that. It is, they know exactly the way they're going because somebody else did, and they know exactly where they want to go because somebody else did, and they know the changes in the benefits, then they know the changes in the routes, they know the changes in how to get from point A to point B on real-time or almost real-time information. And I think that's something different than it used to be. And our policies need to adjust to that. So all these three places, what you see is acute hunger, poverty problems, turning into destabilization, and resulting in migration. Just to give you an idea of how many people, 79.5 million people today are forcibly displaced in the world, highest ever, by far. And you know what's really interesting to me is that 80% of those people still are seeking refuge in countries which by themselves are food insecure and poor. You know, and that's something which we need to really realize. Then the other thing which is very close to my heart is the issues of inequality. We talk about inequality of income. We talk about inequality in opportunity. But there is another inequality, which is inequality in humanitarian assistance, right? If you look at, I will give you two examples here. If you look at, there's something in official development assistance, which is called in donor country refugee support. That is the support which OECD countries, DAC countries, basically provide to the new refugees over the first 12 months. Okay. New refugees, by the way, right? So maybe 2 million, 3 million per year coming in. The bill for that is about $10 billion. If you do the math, I think you'll come to about between $4,000 to $5,000 per capita of refugees. Then you have the humanitarian assistance, which is $15 billion. And that is there to help about 150 to 160 million people. So if you do their math, it is about $100 per capita, right? So think about this for 1 second, right? So if you leave, which you didn't want to do, but somehow if you cross the Mediterranean, you pass the Sahara, and you get to one of these countries, they will spend money on you. But if you stay where you wanted to stay and you are in trouble because of the politics, because of the wars, because of the climate, not a whole lot is spent on you, $100. So $4,000 to $5,000 if you make it, $100 if you don't. Logic, you know. And I think this is something which needs to be said and understood, why it is important to have some kind of a balance in humanitarian assistance on that side. The second one, this I personally experienced a couple of years ago. I was in Bangui in Central African Republic, and standing by the river, looking into DRC, and this guy comes to me and basically says, you know, you guys, we know what you do. I'm like, oh, what do we do? Says, you know, those Syrians, you give them nice packages of food, nice parcels. And us, we have to scoop our food from the ground. Meaning there was an imbalance in what is provided and for how long it is provided in one part of the world or in one country compared to another country. And, you know, 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been a problem. Why? Because they don't see each other. So what we give in let's say Balkans, in one stage, you know, it was chocolate, early 90s, and cheese. What we give in Yemen or Syria, it's rice and tea and sugar and oil, that type of stuff. Then you have in some of these countries in Africa, it is corn or, you know, salt and oil. And that was always unfair, right? Because there was no equality in terms of what we were giving. But they didn't see each other. Now the difference is that they see each other. So they know, so you give, you know, good stuff over there and not so good stuff to us. And you know what my answer was to this guy? And it was a cop-out, which basically was that we are voluntarily funded. We can only give what we have. That is the difference today than before. So inequality in humanitarian assistance matters a whole lot more today. Now, I said in what we are seeing is that all of these things, they have a cost. Because it's very, very clear now that the actions and reactions are no longer in the same place. Again, war in Syria, refugees in Europe. Economic destitution in Central America, migrants in the US. Sahel blows up, you have people showing up in Europe. That wasn't the case before. And we need to understand that part going forward. And frankly, we end up spending a whole lot more money dealing with the consequences of these things than actually dealing with if we were to be dealing with the root causes. Okay. So what are we saying going forward? And I know I'm on half my time, but there is hope. The hope is in understanding that the world has been in these type of situations before. If you said to someone after World War II that some of the countries which are members of G7, some other countries which are doing extremely well, South Korea, after the Korean War, or I even put, in a way, I even put Rwanda after the genocide. If you asked, you know, what are the common things that they did to get themselves out of trouble, basically. And And if you see that, and you study that, you'll see that there are 5 things which they've done. I think those 5 things, they were relevant then, they're relevant today. And when I say then, it is more so, you know, the 70s, 80s in Latin America. You can take before that, you can take the Korean War, and then in the 90s, you can take the genocide, and so on. And those 5 things were, first and foremost, it was the empowerment of women. And why is that? Not just because it's, you know, nice to say that, but more so because it's 50% or 47% of your labor force in the agricultural sector. So unless you choose your labor force, it's really, really hard to succeed. Right? So empowerment of women matters a whole lot. The second one was, if you look in these countries, they invested in their children, young children. Okay. And that is, I like to say to people that, you know, we all do research, but take it one step else and say, what does that mean? You will see, you know, Lancet paper after paper talking about the first 1,000 days and how important it is that from conception to second birth, the mother and the child are well nourished. Because if they are not, it doesn't happen, or it takes a whole lot for people to reach their full productivity. Well, if that is the case, in a globalized world, if the half of the population does not get a good start, and other half does, and they have to interact, what do you think that is going to do? Why don't we talk about these things in our research? The third thing is education. And to me, if you, again, believe your data, and you say, hey, 500 million people are going to enter the labor workforce or labor force by 2030 in Asia and in Africa, which have traditionally been labor-intensive hubs, in times of automation, 3D, printing, AI, what does that mean going forward? Should we not be preparing for that now? 2030 ain't that far, right? So something on that. And then rural infrastructure. To me, what matters is you cannot, even if it was free to produce, you're not going to produce something you cannot sell. So access to markets, feeder roads, electrification, internet. You say, hey, people are moving, young people are moving from rural areas to urban areas because they don't see economic opportunity. How can we create that economic opportunity? Already in the world, urban population has crossed 50% mark, right? So that bringing the facilities of urban areas to rural areas is something which needs to happen, right? So youth, others can see futures, can see things where they are, making agriculture sexy in a way, or viable for that matter, in going forward. And then the last thing for me is social protection, but more so putting monies in the grassroots. When there is a recession in the US or in Western countries, what do? We give people tax breaks, we give people cash back. Why do we do that? Because we know they're not going to put it in the bank and they're going to spend it, so they spend it, so it generates economic activity, and people, certainly you hope that that's an ignition enough for the economy to start running. Why is that any different in a poor country? If you can put monies into the grassroots, if you can build those roads, what you see is that economic activity is created, employment is created. I can give you example of places where this has worked. And then you have the public sector responding to that, the private sector responding to that. So at the end of the day, if you had to put it in 3 categories, you'll say, hey, need to invest in the human capital, need to do something about the food systems, and need to do something on the social protection side. Now, if we do these 3 things, countries big like China, with 1.4 billion people, brought poverty down from 70–80% to less than 10. Hunger down from 7–8% just a couple of decades ago to less than 2.5. These are the things that they did. But is that enough by itself? No. Because in order for these things which I just mentioned to work, you need political will. You need political commitment. You need local ownership. Why? Because hunger is not one-off. If it was one-off, you could solve it from outside. But if you want to get people to zero hunger and keep them on zero hunger, then you better have local solutions. So political commitment matters. Good governance matters. Sustained investments matter. And then finally, coordinated response, bringing the private sector in so they could see these places as their future frontier markets. Countries which have done that have beaten hunger, have beaten poverty, both big and small. And for me, if you want to study this, it's really interesting because I give the example of Rwanda and Burundi, right after genocide, in the same shape, same amount of people, same kind of indicators. Now one is way ahead of the other. There's a lot which needs to happen in Rwanda as well still. But the other one is still where they were 25 years ago. So why? And I think these are the things where we need to push. Because if we are not doing that, we are creating problems in the places, or the problems are already there in the places where they are, but we experience the consequences of those places. So if you're not going to do it for them in a way you can make that point to the politicians, do it for yourself. Because we live in a very interconnected world. Thanks, gentlemen. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arif. That was a great narrative. You took me from hot to cold and from sweet to salty and from fear to hope and back. Yeah. So you started off with some pretty gloomy numbers, which are really very scary because while you gave examples of countries that managed the big push and that have done incredibly well in incredibly short periods of time, all around the world, including China, Rwanda, Europe, etc., South Korea. Despite these achievements, it means it's not good enough because we're still leaving far too many people behind, right? Maybe 10–15% of the world's population is left behind in a way that, if we were a family, we would never accept that, right? So it's really, both from a humanitarian and, as in part you argue, from a self-interested economic utilitarian perspective, unacceptable and undesirable. So you provided a big narrative from sort of conflict, climate change, economic crisis as drivers to food security, which I suppose is your core topic, sort of,
exactly.
At least the people who pay you, yeah. But then, and I really like that you didn't stop there, but that you took it further, sort of, for example, through displacement, yeah, or migration. Whatever the difference exactly is, right? It's hard to know who's displaced and who wants to leave and who has to leave, right? Maybe those who leave don't want to leave, but maybe those who stay behind don't want to stay behind. It's difficult to know. The role of aid and the interconnectedness, you sort of only use the word sort of right at the end, right? But you talked about it all the way through, the role of globalization and how we're all in it together. My worry, why I'm going back to sort of feeling cold and shivery at the end rather than positive and hopeful, is that when you list these 5 factors, female labor, female empowerment, child human capital, labor forces, infrastructure, social protection, etc., it sometimes seems you really need all of them simultaneously, right? And if you don't, if you just provide social protection, you can save lives, but not livelihoods, right? And and only shiny roads don't do the job either. And so I guess the sort of the glue that binds it together is sort of governance in a way, right? And the commitment. Maybe that's what we saw in some countries, even at a cost in terms of democracy and human rights, but from an economic point of view, some country had the governance for that. So how to get that is hard. And yet here in the Households in Conflict Network, we do think about it. Many of us are economists, not all by all means, but we try to combine this sort of analysis of the economic with the political, with the institutional, with the, sometimes with the bad things. So found it very inspiring. If I may ask you a specific question, and I encourage people to either post questions or to somehow let me know, even by private message, if you would like to ask a question. I can then give you the floor. We can ask maybe 2 or 3 questions. My question would be, we know it's difficult in Syria and other crisis countries, but what about the countries in between, the ones who are neither South Korea nor Syria? Yeah. So I sometimes wonder if there's a bit of a gap. I'm speaking now as a researcher, that it's tough to help people in Syria or other acute crisis countries where there's an ongoing emergency. It's tough and it's expensive. And in countries, don't know, Germany, Switzerland, South Korea, maybe we don't need to help the same way. But in between, I sort of feel that maybe there's not enough research or policy attention. Or what's your feeling? Is there a U-shaped curve in terms of what we know and what we don't know?
That's an excellent question. I think, yeah. I mean, you have, in a way, the problem is that the outliers, if you can put it that way, they contain large numbers, right? But the ones in the middle, and I would take you to the Food Systems Summit coming up, right? And a lot of people are hoping that the research out of that would address some of these questions. My point is this, that when you're looking at food systems, you have to see 2 things. That for different countries, there are different pathways, right? What you do in Africa versus what you do in Asia or Latin America, it's going to be different. And then for those pathways, you have different entry points, right? But bottom line is that everybody needs some kind of assistance. The difference comes in that some, especially in the middle, you don't have to start, from A. So technical assistance starts to become a bigger part of their debate than actually doing it, right? Think of India. India has a public distribution system which is supposed to help about 800 million people with the annual budget of, I think it's about $26 billion. So do they need WFP's assistance in terms of food? And hell no, not at all. But could they benefit from changes on the procurement side, on the supply chain side? Could they learn some things from us? Could we learn some things from them? Yeah, definitely. And this is what I mean by pathways and entry points. I think we need to sort of continue to focus on essentially 2 things. One is, doing it for somebody, delivering. And then the other one is enabling others. And the other way you can look at it is that on one side in countries you do direct assistance, but you could also provide services, World Bank, technical assistance, that kind of stuff. Now, another example I wanted to give you was that on the middle of countries, compare green revolution in India versus green revolution in Africa, Agra. And what you would see is that in South Asia, you had the rail, you had the road, and you had irrigation systems already. So the constraint was productivity. So when Borlaug came, and yields went up, it could go everywhere. In Africa, it is different. Why? Because productivity is not a binding constraint in Africa. You can still go up, way up. But the rail, the road, and irrigation is. So unless we resolve those constraints, it is hard to imagine a green revolution in Africa. You see? So this is the middle part. So for me, I mean, getting the wrong right, because wrong is not the same in every place. Getting the wrong right, understanding the problem correctly is half the battle. If you can do that, then you can design proper solutions. Otherwise, you solved something, but you didn't solve what needed solving. And I think this is, Tillman, where research matters. This is where I think as researchers, we need to start helping people, start helping politicians getting the wrong right. Because without that, I don't think we're going to go very far.
Thank you very much. Now we have a couple of questions popping up. I wonder if I can give them to you all three, if that's not unfair, but then you can sort of choose how much time to spend on each. In reverse order, Rahul Mirotra asked, well, first, thanks you for the very informative talk and especially your point about inequality of humanitarian access, and then asked you to please elaborate on some of the supply and or demand side factors that might drive this inequality. It's a very interesting point. I also liked that about inequality. Patricia is asking, Patricia Justino, our co-director of the Houseless Conflict Network, there's been a lot of discussion lately as to whether providing food and reducing hunger will contribute to peace building. What's your take on that discussion? And Philip Verwimpt, the third in the group of co-directors of the HiCN, is asking about COVID-19 crisis, and to some extent, is it business as usual for WFP, presumably because you are in the crisis business already, or is it very different? And in fact, I also wondered whether you saw it more as a shock or whether you saw it as a structural change. And maybe, sorry, a fourth one, and then we're up to date again. Oh, they're popping up as I speak. This is a race. I'm not going to manage to read them out as quickly. Nina von Uxkull from Uppsala University is asking, thank you for a very interesting presentation. You mentioned conflict as one of the key causes of the recent uptick in the number of undernourished people together with climate change. And you presented a number of fields, the empowerment of women, social protection, rural infrastructure, etc. Given that conflict is mentioned as one key driver, I'd love to hear your views on what is important to best handle this conflict food security nexus link more directly. And finally, Jan Elfes from the International Security and Development Center, you compared at different stages the different cost for providing for someone who stays in a crisis situation and someone migrating to another country. However, as we know, only paying more money as development humanitarian aid often doesn't do the job. Therefore, his question is how far these numbers are really comparable and what to conclude from them. Wow, that's a tall order. You have 5 minutes to answer these 5 questions. Please feel free to be selective. I know it's not possible to give justice to them all, but be curious to hear some of your thoughts. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think, look, excellent questions. And yeah, you're right. 5 minutes is not enough. So I'll get right to it. One, by the way, my keynote speech is about telling you what is on the minds of decision makers and humanitarians, development guys. What are the type of questions being asked? So these are not answers. I hope you take some of these as research questions. And what I said, take that as a hypothesis and see what you find as well. I think that's one point I would like to make before. Second one, humanitarian development peace nexus. You know, this is UN 75th anniversary year. 2 years ago, we passed a resolution which for the first time said the starving people is a war crime. Okay, and that 24 resolution 2417, okay, 2417. For the first time this year, Secretary General came and the Security Council, all members agreed to a global ceasefire. Why did that happen? Why are these two things happening? Why did it take 70 plus years for people to get to this point to just even call it in 15, just 15 countries, right? And the reason is because they start to see the cost. Now our job is to quantify that cost. Does early action matter? If wars were industries, is peace a better industry now because we are so connected? That's a research question. And where we are going, what we are seeing is that if you talk about three things, if you say, listen, prevention always, development whenever possible, humanitarian when necessary, we will go a long way. Okay. And by the way, what I just said, this is not my thinking. This is essentially from OECD. Okay. But that is on the mark. So anything we can do to prevent people from fighting, to prevent children becoming malnourished, you can take it. Any chance we get about development, why is that important? Because call it humanitarian, call it development, most places we are talking about the same people. We could do our accounting as we see fit, but to say, I cannot help you because I don't have that type of money, I think that's unfair. You let a town drown because you have the humanitarian money to feed people, but you cannot use that money to build a levee. There's something fundamentally wrong in that logic. And people are listening, and I think this is where we need to push. COVID shocks, different, structural. I think the structural part of that is the silver linings which COVID has brought out. Somebody once, I was giving this talk at Chatham House, and it was like, I was talking about the same thing, rural infrastructure within food systems context. But imagine if you have that infrastructure that is not only for food systems, right? The SOEM roads can be used to move the vaccine or to move anything else you want. So that link is the structural link. What is it that we can build back better out of COVID? For us, COVID's biggest disruptions were the logistics disruptions. And I don't mean just Tillman said, we were running the biggest airline in Africa, but the last mile restrictions. You got to the port, you brought it to the port, you brought to the airfield, or you got to the border of a country, but now they want the driver tested. Or they say, I'll change their drivers. Well, those things don't happen, that kind of stuff. So, but it has been a learning experience. What we have learned and where we have also been successful is all this remote monitoring we do. In 38 countries, we are monitoring food security situations on a daily basis, health situation on a daily basis through remote measures. That is all new. And look, on the inequality side, for me, basically, it is both. It is not only demand side, it is not only supply side, it is both. But the most important part over there, Rahul, is that people are not even aware of all of these things. They don't, it's not even, I've had many senior people actually look at me and say, oh, I never thought of it this way. So, and this is our problem in many, many ways, where our technologies have moved way ahead of us in our rules and regulations and how we deal with problems are lagging behind. So it's not out of malice or anything, but that's the way it is. But we need to get to a point where we start to look at these things in terms of their negative externalities, if we can put it that way, because it's not intentional. But how do we address those? And I think that is where we need more research. Also, where we need more research, and I've said it to everybody, I'll say it to you, quantifying the cost of inaction. What I gave you is anecdotal. I can give you numbers on the wall in the US. So far spent is about $11 billion, most expensive wall. Some say it is $20 billion. I can tell you the expenditures on the Sahel side. I can tell you expenditures on the Syria, Europe side, how much money Europe has spent over the last few years on to assist those refugees, which made it. All of that is there, but is it an empirical study? No, it's not. We're not there. So if one thing you guys, if you can do, and I would love to be part of that, is to take this one step ahead and say, let's talk about truly quantifying cost of inaction. Okay, come on, I'll stop here. I know I'm past my 1 o'clock. And you've been doing well.
I actually think we could keep listening to you. It would be very stimulating still, yeah? But everybody has been really good in being really engaged with this online conference what's all morning in Europe. So I think maybe they deserve a bit of food. That's in the spirit of what you talk about as well. So I think we should have a lunch break now. But I really would like to thank you for providing this big picture and also for connecting it to what the research agendas are. And I think that's really valuable. And it just shows what good thinker and deep thinker you are, because I think it's very rare to have somebody who make these different connections, yeah, and to tell such a compelling story and to base it on the one hand on scholarship and on the other hand on policy discussions and knowing what the policymakers think about it. And so you're really bridging different communities here, and I think that's extremely insightful and a very rare talent. So thank you for taking the time to share that with us. We really appreciate you being here. And if I can maybe ask everybody either to unmute or show the camera, clap, wave, or thank in the comment box, whatever technology you have at your disposal to show our appreciation to Arif. Yeah. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Look forward to keep engaging with you in the future.
Right. Absolutely. I love that. I'm a researcher at heart. Don't forget that. Okay.
Thank you
so
much.
Bye, you guys.
We'll have you back. Thank you so much, Arif.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.